moderator this morning for this session, so I'd like to introduce Tom. Tom's my colleague at the Forage and Range Lab. He's been with ARS for 12 years and conducts research on rangeland and invasive plant ecology. He also studies vegetation dynamics and management alternatives for semi-arid shrublands in the Great Basin. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting me to be here. In the years past at this symposium, we've usually had a session devoted to annual grasses or to invasive weeds. And it's good to see that that's still a big interest to us, because when we think about native plants, one of the biggest obstacles that we often face will be invasive plants. So hopefully what I have to say today will be highly relevant to each of your endeavors that you have in your own research. Okay, this title today is 65 Years of Cheatgrass Control. As you all know, we've been working on cheatgrass for a long, long time. And what I'm going to do today is to show you the efforts that I've done to try to review this literature and how it helped us to develop a conceptual model. And then I'm going to go through what we've done with some of that data. We've mined other people's data and put it into a meta-analysis so that we can benefit from it today. So yesterday we said we wouldn't be looking back. Well, we're going to look back a little bit to help us to go into the future. First of all, as Tom mentioned, I work at the Forage and Range Research Lab, and we have a mission to provide improved plant materials as well as management alternatives. So I'm in a really awesome place where I get to work with this diverse group of people to come up with management alternatives and utilize some of the plant materials that are being developed at my lab. And our lab has numerous research groups. We're a very diverse group there. We have irrigated pastures and rangeland ecology and plant materials, which is the group I'm a member of. We also have turf grass as well as dryland biomass emphases. I'd like to also recognize before I get started today that the efforts that have gone into this project were not just my own. There's many people who assisted me with this, and this stems from years of working together, but also we identified this need at a symposium last year in Reno that was specifically on cheatgrass control. And so Jane Mangold, Cindy Brown, Rachel and Brian Mueller, Justin Williams, and Sarahi Felix, who are at our lab at Utah. And we had a very easy, basic goal, and that was to look at this literature that has been compiled over the last 65 years and look at it and analyze it very carefully so that we could develop some new improved outlooks and possibly some new management strategies. So a way to encapsulate what's happened in the past so that we can forge into the future. So today I'm first going to go through the systematic review of that literature, kind of show you what it's like so you can see the whole breadth of it and understand everything that's already been done in the past. Then I'm going to show you how we developed a conceptual model. Now, a conceptual model is just a way that we can kind of use boxes and arrows just to kind of think about what are the drivers of change that might be influencing the abundance of cheatgrass and the site dynamics where all of us might be working. And then I'm going to show you the meta-analysis, the actual data towards the end, and then try to make sense of it. So, as you all know, the Great Basin is our ecosystem of interest, and cheatgrass's control literature actually expands way beyond the Great Basin, but I'd have to say the majority of it falls within this ecosystem. And as you may know, the Great Basin is a very large area. It's highly diverse and is considered a threatened ecosystem and is a continuing story of change, and cheatgrass plays a big role in that story of change. All of us would probably love to think that we can get back to something like this. This is a very good goal. This is a very nice stand. Kirk Davies provided this photograph. And we understand the challenges of managing for this type of a system. This system across the board has largely diminished and is gone. And as we talk about the Anthropocene today, it will become quite evident that some of the challenges of getting back to a system like this are almost overwhelming, and cheatgrass plays a key role in keeping us from getting back to something like this. And another thing we're going to be talking about today are some of the novel changes that have occurred to these ecosystems. We have to consider them. We have to understand what processes and changes that have occurred on our landscape over the last 100 or so years. And first of all, we understand that these areas were used for grazing lands. And in the case of Utah, we had millions of livestock on our foothills utilizing rangelands within the Great Basin. One of the other pressures is after some of those disturbances came through, another novel change in these ecosystems was dryland farming. And that's another aspect of some of my colleagues that I've worked with over the last 5 years. They've been studying the impacts and the distribution of some of these areas that were dryland farmed. And as you know, dryland farming is a huge disturbance. Oftentimes our rangelands would look like this photograph up here. It looks very different than that first photo I showed. So this included tillage and temporarily growing dryland wheat for a number of years and then abandoning it. And across the landscape we can still see those things, even though a lot of these things were ceded to dryland farming in the turn of the century. Most of it in this particular area in Park Valley, Utah, was between 1900 and 1915. So almost 50 years later, you can still see the scars on the landscape, and we've studied these things intensively. And even 100 years later, you can still see the scars, as shown here on the far right. On the ground, here's a picture of me out there searching for these old dryland farms, and every once in a while you come across a tell, like in this case, you can see that there's a little rabbit fence here, and that indicated that we were most likely within the area that was dryland farmed 100 years ago. But sometimes they're a little bit more obvious, where you can actually see that here's, in this case, a sickle bar mower still sitting in the soil left out in the sagebrush. So this is just to give you a perspective of the types of novel changes that have occurred in our rangelands today, which sets the stage to this issue of cheatgrass. And as you probably are all aware, many efforts went in, many decades of work went into trying to identify plant materials as well as management strategies to deal with cheatgrass. This particular photograph was taken by A.C. Hull back in probably the late 30s on some of the areas that he and some of his colleagues were doing research on trying to replace cheatgrass on these areas that were degraded, as I illustrated on the first couple slides here. And they identified plant materials to work out in that setting. And that wasn't the end of it. In addition to that, some of these dryland farm areas where the sagebrush had already been removed and they farmed it for a number of years, they went in to try to reseed these types of areas. And in other areas where the understory was completely gone, there was an era of probably 20 years where they were tearing out sagebrush and doing everything they could to keep sagebrush from coming back to protect their seedings of these exotic grasses that were supporting the livestock industry. And here's another photograph from A.C. Hull. And this is during the era of the 50s, where during the Halogeton Act, where the majority of the sagebrush manipulations were going on throughout the region that I work in. And ultimately, what it left us with was either highly degraded lands, those are the areas that were not touched after dryland farming or heavy grazing, or in some cases they converted them to crested wheatgrass, holding down the soil and protecting that resource for the region. So here we are today, 50 years later, and we're still dealing with the same type of situation. We're not tearing out shrubs as much, and we're definitely not dealing with a different issue. In fact, we're dealing with the same exact issue. Cheatgrass is still dominant. So after 65 years, we really need to take a very close look at what we've done to try to control this plant, so we can go into the future with a new outlook. And this is to illustrate it. Most of the areas that I work in look a lot like this. They're salt desert ecosystems, or else they're Wyoming big sagebrush systems that are totally converted to cheatgrass. And the ranchers that utilize these areas, and I work with these guys, they value that resource. But many years they can't utilize it enough, and it creates enough fuel. It's the same site, and you can see here that there's a huge fire hazard, and the fires just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we realize that something needs to be done about this, and some of the landowners that we've teamed up with are very interested in looking for new strategies. They're aware of the old strategies. They've been working with these issues for a long time, but they're still looking for new strategies. So what I'm going to propose today is that we need to look at the literature very closely so we can come up with ways to identify what we've learned in the past, find the weaknesses, so we can forge forward. And first of all, I just want to illustrate to you that one of the first things we did is to go into the literature. We identified over 5,000 papers initially that had dealt with cheatgrass control. We found that a total of about 494 were very specific and contained data that was of the ecological nature, and of those there was about 119 that specifically addressed cheatgrass control. And as you can see, as you look at the literature across time, there's been a large increase in the interest in the research literature for cheatgrass, and that also is reflected in control. But it wasn't really until about 2007 where it really started to expand. So this topic today is highly relevant. We're still dealing with this issue, but the control literature is just starting to ramp up. And I'm going to go through a number of slides here today to kind of show you what that literature looks like. If you tried to break up those 119 studies, this is how it would pretty much fall out. About 36% of them dealt with herbicides, and 29% dealt with burning. And revegetation was a common one that included reseeding and the evaluation of plant materials to control cheatgrass. Woody removal, that includes pinyon juniper removal as well as shrub removal. Defoliation, that is using grazing. Soil disturbances, which was often used in conjunction with these other things, and particularly it was used quite often to develop a good seed bed for seeding. And soil amendments, which are about 8%, and those are more recent. People are using amendments similar to what Andrew was talking about yesterday to try to control cheatgrass by facilitating an interaction with the soil. Another way to look at this is the number of methods that people have used in combination. The majority of the literature illustrates that most studies conducted on the ground were only a single treatment at a time. So they would look at one thing, and that's about 55% of it. But surprisingly, and this really did surprise me, is that the number of studies that used two methods in conjunction was about 39%. Very few studies evaluated more than two. Another way of looking at this information, hopefully you guys can see this. This is the number of articles here on the y-axis, but this is interesting because it tells us what size of plot do people actually implement a cheatgrass control study. And this is another figure that really surprised us, that surprisingly a good amount of literature illustrated that people were treating land at 10 to 100 square meters. So that was pretty interesting. But it's overall across the board. There's a diversity of sizes of treatment areas that people have been studying this. So people are implementing these things on the landscape at large as well as small scales. But this is one thing that was a little bit concerning to us, is that when people actually sample things, they're actually looking at smaller plots. In most cases, less than a meter. So it's sometimes hard to scale those things up. And as we all know, it's an annual grass, and so oftentimes we have to treat it numerous times. But most of the time, when you look at all these data points, most of them fall out that people would treat once and then that was it. But as we know, cheatgrass is highly resilient and it keeps coming back. Let's see here. And the longest monitoring period was also revealing, but it also provided us a good opportunity to kind of look at short-term as well as long-term responses. And this was really good. Most people would, even though they treated it only once, would monitor it for between 1 and 5 years. And that really came into play as we started to do the meta-analysis, because we could look at the temporal dependence of that control. We've all probably seen it. You treat something and you get pretty good response, but over time it goes away. And we're going to be looking at that dynamic very closely here in a minute. Okay, so let's just kind of move on here, because after reviewing the literature, what we did is we took those 7 control methods that were the most common, and just about every single paper could be categorized into one of those control methods. And what we tried to do is think about it conceptually and say, okay, if we were to develop a model, a very simple model where people can start thinking about some of the processes that they need to be impacting, or what are the control points if we wanted to be more successful. we felt a model could help people do that. And this is really what we came up with. And I'm going to be illustrating this model a little bit later. And it's really a simple model. And if you were to look at the literature that we just reviewed, you would see that a good portion of it focuses on treating Bromus tectorum or cheatgrass seed banks. And there's lots of different controls there. You can actually have an impact that has direct control over the mortality of that seed bank. Let's look over here at the Bromus tectorum plants. A lot of treatments will focus directly on trying to control adult plants. And there's an interesting dynamic between there shown there with the seed. That control point is very key because we need to ask ourselves the question, do control methods actually prevent seed banks from going into adult plants and vice versa, from control plants from having dispersal and reproduction to go back into the seed bank? And we kind of consider those top two box control points as top-down controls, where we implement it right in the ground and we have those direct impacts. But there's another whole group of control points that are operating from the bottom up, and the literature helped us define them. And the first one I'll talk about is the resident plant community. The resident plant community, if you get a seeding established or if you have a good resilient plant community there where you're implementing a control, it can have a really strong impact on how Bromus tectorum responds to that control measure, as shown here in F with that control point. And probably the most dynamic control point, which is going to take us many, many years to try to disentangle, is shown there in the E, between the soils and the seed banks, the Bromus the Bromus plants, as well as the resident plant community. And really what that is there's a lot of studies that modify the soil surface, for instance, and modify soil resources, and a lot of those things have already been reviewed elsewhere. But they have an impact not only on seed banks, but on plants as well as the resident plant community. And I'm going to be addressing each of these as we go throughout the meta-analysis. And then if you look at the control point D that came out from the literature, and that is if you modify the soil surface, things like litter and bare ground. Thank goodness many of the researchers would report those things. You can see that it has a direct impact on the emergence from the seed banks. So this is the model that we kind of use to kind of go forward with the data analysis, so we could address each one of these control points, A through F. So the meta-analysis was conducted. We basically opened up every single paper and we identified all of the data points. And in order to be a data point, you had to have a control as well as a treatment. And we would then contrast those two. Many studies were conducted in many areas and had many different treatments. And we would take the early measurements, so that would be called the short term, then we'd take their long-term measurements, and so we could contrast the temporal response of the control measure being implemented on the land. And we used a real simple statistic, and it was just the ratio of the treatment to the control, and then we calculated confidence intervals around that. In many cases, there were studies that provided 30 to 40 data points, but they were independent. And this was a type of analysis that we could use to compare across all these different sites, all these different research projects that had gone on over the last 65 years. So let's just take a look at the seed bank density. The first thing I wanted to illustrate for you here today is that if you, first of all these graphs are going to look about the same. If you look off to the left, it's the impact of these control measures, so burning, defoliation, and so on. And we looked at it in the short term as well as the long term. And I need to just describe something to you today right here. Here is the mean of 13 different data points that came from 2 different studies, for instance. And here's the zero line. If you're on this side of the zero line, what that suggests is that you had a strong negative impact on downy brome seed density. So here it shows in the short term, herbicides had a real strong impact, and it was much greater compared to these other treatments. But another way of looking at this is all treatments that people applied in the short term, they had a strong response, and that's looking across the entire literature. In the long term, most of those treatments diminished. The only one that really stuck around, and this is going to come back again and again and again, and it's going to reemphasize the importance of revegetation, when you do revegetate, you still keep the seed banks low. The certain treatments, although they were significant in the short term, like burning, in the long term, you can see that they actually increase seed production. And that may seem like a paradox to you, but if you look at the literature, particularly back in the 40s and 50s, they started to identify the fact that if you did control cheatgrass, what happens is the plants that survive in the seed bank under lower density, they produce orders of magnitude more seed. Okay? So that's really what's going on. Sometimes a real effective treatment will produce low density, and those surviving plants produce a lot of seed. Let's look at seed production, and that kind of is illustrated here. For instance, in burn treatments, you can see that once again. Now, this is production per plant. This is not just what's measured in the seed bank. The production per plant, for instance, on soil disturbance and burning is quite high. And in the long term, you can see that that same thing continues. Certain treatments tend to actually cause the plants to create actually more seeds. You're creating a bigger monster almost. And let's just look at cheatgrass abundance. Now, cheatgrass abundance is really difficult because people use lots of different measures, but the three most common measures that people used were biomass, cover, and density. And as you can see, it depends on what you're measuring. If you went out there a year after you implemented a treatment and you said, okay, I'm only going to measure biomass, you're going to say, wow, we really knocked back cheatgrass. But if you're measuring density, you'd say, yeah, it's still significant, but it's not as great as we had hoped. But here's going to be the common story throughout this today, is that in the short term, we get the control we wanted, but over the long term, in the case of cover, if you're only measuring only cover, you could say, well, 3 years later, it's actually a significant increase. But as we know, this is an annual plan. Whenever you control it, it seems to get bigger and bigger, unless you implement some bottom-up types of controls, and we'll get to those. So this kind of illustrates what I was just saying. Many of the treatments initially have really good control over cheatgrass abundance. Now, this is the combine of those three variables. But in the long term, the take-home message here is that many of them actually increase bromus tectorum over time. Let's see how the perennial grasses respond. And that's the really cool thing about this literature base, is that most people, they're not just measuring cheatgrass when they're out there, they're measuring how the resident plant community is responding. In most cases, if you look across the board, they always measured perennial grass abundance, and that was really helpful. And here's the good news, is that when people do tend to control cheatgrass, you get a positive response in the perennial grass community. So that's a good thing. And some of them, particularly when people are measuring biomass, they're seeing a great increase in the response to the perennial grasses. And looking at all of the treatments independently here, you can see that burning, for instance, although it increases cheatgrass, as we saw earlier, it has a lasting impact on the abundance of perennial grasses. Defoliation, as you can see here, as livestock like to eat perennial grasses too, you can see that it's a negative response, but that tends to increase over time, the effect of defoliation. Herbicides, across the board here, tend to increase the perennial grasses. And I wish I had time to go into each and every one of these interactions, but I think you guys can see the take-home message. So initially, when people would apply a treatment, you'd see a reduction in cheatgrass, but over time that would increase. And it's almost the exact opposite with the perennial grasses. You would see a slower lagging response, but eventually people would leave the land. If there was seed in the ground and they implemented seeding, you'd see that there's a pretty good response there. And another thing that people typically measured was bare ground, because bare ground is really important. Because bare ground and the soil surface is an important characteristic for cheatgrass. Cheatgrass seeds don't like to germinate on the bare soil, for instance. They like to germinate in litter. And this is just an indication of how some of the control methods impact bare ground, and those are an important part of our conceptual model. Defoliation removes a good amount of plant material and creates greater bare ground, for instance. And another thing here is that herbicides, over the long term, maintain that as well as revegetation. So all these things are actually increasing the bare ground. Now bare ground means not only is it just more bare ground, but it also means that there's less litter. And let's look at the other half of what the ground looks like. Oftentimes, in the short term, when you use herbicide, you'll actually kill cheatgrass and create actually more litter. And so there's some dynamics going on here. And you know, herbicides and woody removal in the long term tend to actually increase litter effects. So oftentimes we think that these treatments are actually doing something positive, and they may be. They may be doing top-down control things. They might be killing the plants or affecting the seed bank, but they're also doing other things to the system that may be actually facilitating cheatgrass. And that's where we needed to kind of pull this all together, start looking at the conceptual model so we can kind of understand it a little bit better. So here's a closer look at that model. And so I'm going to kind of talk about some of the overall responses as I conclude here. So the first thing that we identified by looking at these controls, all these different control methods, is that there's somewhat of a paradox. When we attempt to try to control from the top down, oftentimes we are successful in the short term, but in the long term they tend to all increase, and that seems to be due to the relationship between plant density and their overall productivity of new seeds. Okay? And another thing is that when we establish a seeding, it has a real strong competitive effect on controlling cheatgrass plants, and that's really important. In fact, in the long term, if you looked at all of the control measures, revegetation was the only one that had significant impact on cheatgrass in the long term. And that's quite telling to us. So we can't just control it. We have to put something into our management plan that will provide a bottom-up effect on cheatgrass. Another thing that really came out here, and that's very, very dynamic, is the aspect of soils. And I've been involved in a number of projects over the years, and I fully understand how complicated these arrows can be. For instance, you know, when we impact soils, it impacts the microbial communities, it impacts what's on the soil surface, it impacts resources, and it's a very complex one, but I think we can encapsulate it right here in a very simplified model, is that we have to be thinking about what control points are going to be impacted when we apply a treatment. And hopefully this literature review and meta-analysis we've done gives us an idea of what are the things we need to be focusing on. Like oftentimes we go out there and we create really good bare ground and it produces a good seed bed, but if we don't get something established, you know, it can have a real strong effect going in this direction and actually cause cheatgrass to get much, much worse. But if we can do a treatment, for instance, that maintains the soil surface, ideal for not only the perennial grasses but keeps cheatgrass low, and then in that case would keep litter low, then you can start seeing it have a real strong impact on the germination from these seed banks. That's just as an example. So we're forging forward with this conceptual model and this meta-analysis, and hopefully we'll get it published here in the next year. We're about to submit it actually, and then we can utilize this type of an outlook as we forge into the future by understanding what's gone on in the past. It really gives us a lot of new information actually by mining the past, because we can see what people have tried, and most importantly we understand what is going to be impacted. And the devil's in the details. Understanding these control points are not entirely answered to this point. And what this last slide here really kind of illustrates is that in our research, as we forge into the future, we really have to be thinking about these control points. For instance, how does a control measure impact seed demography of cheatgrass as well as seed demography of the perennial species we're trying to reestablish in these cheatgrass stands? And that has to do with plant demography as well. How will the treatment impact reproduction and dispersal? Soil surface and seedbed characteristics are very essential for us to be keeping in mind of. And soil resources and microbial interactions are also very key. But I have to say that, you know, it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that we've really been focusing on them, so we've got a lot of catch-up to do, but we understand based on what we've been hearing the last couple of days is the soils are very, very important in impacting weeds. And then competition from establishing a seeding is going to be critical. It's going to be something we'll have to continue to emphasize in the past, because looking across 65 years, it was the most effective treatment to actually keep cheatgrass at bay, establishing a seeding. Well, I thank you for your time.
Hey Tom, it looks like that the revegetation was the primary long-term effect. But when you showed up the perennial grasses, revegetation had a short-term negative effect and a long-term zero effect. So it's not the perennial grasses that are doing the control job out there on revegetation. What is?
So that's a really good question. He's asking why is it that perennial grasses aren't showing a positive response when we actually do revegetation? Well, just because it's not having a positive response doesn't mean that they're not having a response. And what this means is they are established, and they oftentimes are at low density. I could probably show you that the density covering biomass kind of illustrates this, but they're there. They're at lower density, but I think that they take a much longer time period for them to really start having an impact. But they are having an impact on cheatgrass based on what we're seeing in the literature, because cheatgrass is lowest in the long term when revegetation has occurred. But revegetation is an interesting thing because oftentimes those treatments are used with a lot of other treatments in conjunction with it. And we pulled out the independent effects. Oftentimes when we do revegetation, it's, they've prepared a seed bed, and they possibly used herbicide and so forth. So there's a lot more detail that needs to be pulled out of this, but your question is a really good one, Val.
One more question?
Was any specific litter removal done when there was revegetation?
Okay, the question was, did people actually try to remove litter? They didn't actually physically remove it like with implements and things, but most of the time when litter was being removed, it was during a process of either burning, and for many years, particularly in the late 60s, they were utilizing a method called the chemical fallow, where they would use herbicides to create a fallow so they wouldn't have to cultivate the soil. And that was a highly effective treatment. Well, thank you for your time.